When you do begin with a structure, you don't carefully work out the structure. Like this, for example, where you carefully draw this square, and then, let's say, another square, and then another square, like that, and then you try to fit your subject within that structure. That is not a good idea, because you're going to go crazy trying to fit your subject into that structure. A better way to begin, which doesn't involve you trying to work like you're in a straitjacket, is to have a structure in mind. Let's say those square shapes, which form a rhythmic structure because I'm repeating that shape. Remember, the underlying structure is a rhythmic structure. The way you can begin is just loosely and roughly you sketch in the structure, but when you begin to draw the subject, you don't try to fit it within those shapes, within that structure. The structure that you do establish, you just draw in light lines like that. You can hardly see them, and roughly. And the positions of those shapes are going to change as you develop your subject. So the subject may not fit into that square that you initially established. The subject may go outside it. So therefore, you have to make adjustments to the structure, and now that shape might become a rectangle. You see how the structure will change depending on the subject and how the whole composition develops. But you're starting out with just a rough basis for the structure, which will change as you continue to work on the composition. So this rough sketch here, not sure what this could be. Maybe it's this queen. She's sitting on her throne, and the throne has this square-like shape, and you see that underlying structure now is turning into this part of the throne that she's sitting on. The position of the shapes that make up that underlying structure may change and are slightly changing. So back here, maybe there's some figures standing here. Maybe it's her guard. And those figures become part of that square shape or rectangular shape of the underlying structure that I lightly and roughly indicated before I started drawing any subjects. So you see that underlying structure is changing, but it's basically still there. So I can continue working on this, and let's see, maybe add something over here as well, like this. The whole picture is tilting a little bit, make it a bit more dynamic looking. The structure is going to change, but that idea of this rhythmic structure of either rectangles or squares making a rhythmic underlying structure will still be there, but it will look different from the way it looked when I initially indicated it. Now this rough sketch here lacks a story. Remember what I said about the importance of a story. Your pictures should tell a story. And if they tell a story, your pictures are going to be much more interesting. So what could the story be? Well, let's say there is this alien creature here at her feet. And she has her hand on his shoulder like that. So I just have to think about what this creature should look like. I went ahead and developed this rough sketch a little further and enlarged it somewhat so that you can see it better. Now the original underlying structure that I started out with, as you know, were these square-like shapes. As the composition developed, however, those square-like shapes turned into rectangular shapes. And you can see it with these implied lines here. The top of the heads of those figures form an implied line. Remember what I said about the edges of shapes, or the tips of the shapes, forming implied lines. So here is just a rough sketch of those robots that I showed you earlier. And remember I said that there was an implied line that was created by the edge of those shapes. Because they're all lined up like that, they create that implied line. Now the same thing is occurring here with the top of these heads. Because they're lined up like that, they form an implied line that goes all the way across like that. Also an implied line right there, going right across. And then in combination with that implied line at the top, it forms a rectangle. The feet here, or the bottom of these figures, when lined up like that, just as the heads, when lined up like that, form an implied line. But the distance from here to here is a long distance, and to make that line a bit more definite, what I did was I added this right there. That little bit of tone makes an edge, which is considered a line, and then that little bit of tone right there also. So I have this line here and a line there, and then I have this line over here and here. And now the implied line that results from that becomes more definite. And here is an example of how you can make an implied line more definite by just adding a little bit of tone like that, or some little detail, just to help that implied line along and make it a bit more definite. When I talk about lines needing to align like this in order to form an implied line, the thing is, you don't always need to align them exactly like that. They can be off a little bit, and still you get the feeling that they're connected. And usually this is what occurs, so as not to make something too obvious looking. The reason why you sometimes use this approach, where you don't line up the lines exactly like this, is when the structure will appear too obvious looking. When you line things up perfectly and you look at the picture and the structure pops out at you, it becomes very obvious to you. Then you need to make an adjustment to those implied lines so that they're more like this. They don't line up perfectly, but yet you still get the feeling that there is a continuous implied line. The underlying structure must remain hidden. It must not become obvious. It does its work unnoticed by the viewer. And that results in a successful underlying structure, when that underlying structure remains hidden. I think this implied line that I pointed out needs a little help, just like this one did, where I added that tone here and over here. So to make this line a bit more obvious, but not so obvious that it becomes too obvious, like I mentioned, I could maybe add a line here. You see that line and see that line? That helps that implied line along its way like that. So it doesn't become too obvious. It's a dark tone, dark against dark, something like that. Let me give you an example of the structure becoming too obvious. So let's say I give these guys hats. And then over here, where her throne is, I add a light tone like that, and another hat on this other guy. See how obvious that line now becomes? That implied line becomes very obvious. And down here, I'll do the same. I'll add this tone, a a little further out like that, and then the bottom of the figures here. And now that line, that implied line, becomes very obvious, too obvious. So this is what you need to avoid. This sort of thing, when these implied lines become obvious like this, then the structure no longer remains hidden, and it just becomes an annoyance. I'm going to return the implied lines to the way they were before, and now you can see that the underlying structure is no longer obvious. So this is what you need to establish in your compositions, and not this. And now it's time to get back to showing you the rest of this underlying structure, because remember what I said, the underlying structure is a rhythmic structure. So let me roughly sketch in the rest of this underlying structure. So there's that rectangle. Then there's a rectangle right there with an implied line going right across over here. And there's this square-like shape here. I just added a little bit of tone over here. The reason for that is because I want a rectangle shape here, like that. Now that little bit of tone I added relates to what I talked about over here, remember? So adding just a little bit of tone or some kind of edge or something will help to make the implied line or shape more definite. So by adding that little bit of tone here, which could be a fold or something, I am able to establish this rectangular shape here, like that. Now this implied line isn't very obvious. There's a gap here, and the edge of the chair here doesn't exactly line up with this tone. But you still get the feeling that they're connected, that they form this implied line. Now, let me bring back the structure, and I need to add this rectangle shape. So as you can see, the structure consists of a series of rectangular shapes, but I started out with the more square-like shapes, and then my structure turned into more of a structure that has rectangular shapes. So the structure that you start out with may change. On the other hand, it may not. It all depends on how the composition develops and what it needs, what its needs are. So if a square doesn't work very well and a rectangle works better, then you use a rectangle. There's more to this structure than just the rectangular shapes. Remember what I said about adding contrasting motifs so that there is some relief from the motif that you select to be the dominant motif for this underlying structure. So here I'm introducing something that I didn't talk about earlier, and that is that there needs to be a dominant motif. That is, one motif, such as the rectangle here, that is used more than another motif for the underlying structure that contrasts with that dominant motif. That contrasting motif, that secondary motif, is used in a fewer number of places within the structure. So you have a dominant motif and you have a subdominant motif. And in this structure, there is a subdominant motif, which is the triangle shape that I'm going to show you in just a second. And here is that triangle motif. The underlying shape, which is an implied shape for the queen, is this triangle. If you've watched my other videos on composition, I've talked about implied shapes before. So if you remember what you learned about implied shapes then, that'll help you to understand what I'm talking about here. The implied shape is a shape that underlies a more complex shape. When you look at the queen here, you see that it suggests, or it feels like it is a triangle shape, like that. Compare how it looks now, and then when I add the triangle. I think you can see that the figure of the queen with her clothing seems to form this triangle shape. And that triangle is a simple geometric shape that underlies the more complex shape that you see, which I'm going to outline now. That shape is more complex. It's not a simple triangle shape like that, but that triangle shape underlies this more complicated shape. So no matter how complicated a shape may appear, it has this more simple underlying shape, which is called an implied shape. You don't actually see a triangle here. What you do actually see is this more complicated shape. But nevertheless, it can be reduced to a more simple geometric shape like this, which is the implied shape. And the implied shape is constructed with implied lines. Now, this counter motif or contrasting motif is usually repeated, just as the dominant motif is repeated, forming a rhythm. Therefore, this triangle has been repeated here within this alien creature, like that. And I might even repeat it somewhere else, maybe over here, on her clothing. And we bring back the rectangular motif. So that's what it looks like combined. Remember what I said, that the structure that you design should lead to the center of interest. Therefore, the implied lines that you set up should not lead away from the center of interest, but to the center of interest. The structure itself can be set up so that the shapes contrast in such a way that those contrasting shapes draw your attention to the center of interest. In this structure, I noticed that the way I established these rectangular shapes, they are moving from large to a smaller shape to an even smaller shape. And therefore, the eye moves along these shapes from larger to smaller. It's like this. If I set something up like this down here, for example, the eye is going to follow this progression of sizes from large to small. And therefore, the eye is moving up toward the top part of the figure where the head is located. In addition, the triangle shape here has an edge that is drawing the eye up like that. The eye follows a tapering of a shape. So if I have a shape like this, for example, the eye follows this taper, going from a taller part of the shape toward a more narrow part. So that's the direction in which the eye travels. And that's what's occurring with the triangle shape here. The eye is following this tapering from wide at the bottom to narrow up here. So that's another way that the eye is being directed toward the center of interest, which is the upper part of her figure. It's the head, really, that is the center of interest, or focal point, as it's also called. Now, these figures back here, because they're lined up like that, they also move the eye inward toward the figure. Remember what I said about those robots? And here's just a quick, rough sketch of those robots. It's the shapes of the robots lined up like that that actually form an implied line like that. Whenever you have a shape that you repeat again and again, like I did here, whether that shape is repeated exactly the same or is varied somewhat, but the shapes still look similar to each other, the eye then follows those shapes. So it moves from one shape to the next, thereby setting up an implied line. So the eye follows that implied line. And that's what's happening over here with those figures in the background. The eye follows those figures, moving from one figure to the next, and over to where the queen is sitting, which is the center of interest. So far, I've pointed out to you the two motifs that I used for this underlying structure. However, there is a third motif. You can use more than two motifs. When you use, let's say, three motifs, and you have different shapes, that makes the structure even more interesting. So the third motif is also a geometric motif, which is the circle that you see right there, back of the head of the queen. And of course, down here, the orb that this creature is holding, and the head of the queen is also a circular shape. It's not a circle, it's more of an oval, so the oval is a variation of the circle. So there you have it. That's the underlying structure, consisting of these three different motifs. And this variety of motifs adds a lot of interest to this underlying structure. And the circle motif, that further helps to draw attention to the head, the focal point. The eye is always attracted to circles. So whenever you put a circle within your painting, the eye is going to be attracted to that circle. So it's a powerful way of attracting the viewer to where you want the viewer to look. The underlying structure was worked out roughly in this small, rough sketch. So even at this early stage where you begin to plan your composition and you make these rough sketches, you try to incorporate some kind of underlying structure into the sketch, which may change somewhat as the sketch is developed into a more finished sketch, which leads to a more finished painting eventually. Now I went ahead and enlarged this sketch, as you can see. What I want to mention now is what I mentioned before with these little robots. Those shapes repeated like that form this implied line, as I mentioned. When you look at these butterfly-like creatures that are being released from this canister by this alien astronaut Grim Reaper, those butterfly creatures form an implied line because the shapes have been repeated just like these robot shapes have been repeated, forming an implied line. Because these shapes are repeated and similar, the eye follows those shapes, moving from one to the next, and so on. Now, what I could do is add maybe another butterfly over here and another one here. That helps to draw the eye up toward his head. So the implied line is directing the attention of the viewer along these butterfly-like creatures toward the head. The implied line is not drawing the eye away from the head, but to the head. And that's what these implied lines need to do, as I mentioned before. They need to lead the eye to the center of interest and not away from it. I think I'm going to eliminate this little butterfly-like creature right there because that shape draws the eye in this direction and away from this implied line. So by eliminating that little shape there, that helps the eye to stay on track here. and follow that implied line to the head. Moving on now to showing you more examples of rhythmic structures. So the way you can start is like I showed you before. You could have some kind of structural concept in mind, and for this rough sketch I'm thinking of a circle which will be repeated someplace else, and maybe there'll be a large tree trunk here like this, and over here there might be a figure standing, and he has something in his hands. Not sure what that could be. So all of that could be the leaves of the tree. Coming up further here with the tree trunk. Really rough sketch for now. And back here there could be maybe a town. And there's some bushes in the foreground. There's a path right here that's leading to him. Some more bushes, maybe some rocks here. You can see how that circle that I started with is beginning to change a bit. It's extending down like this now and out of the picture area. These geometric underlying shapes do not always need to be within the picture area. They can extend outside of the picture area like this. So what you begin with will probably change. As you can see in this example, I started with that circle and now it's turning into something of an oval shape. Starting out with those few initial marks that I put down to establish some kind of picture, you can see what that led to. I developed the rough sketch much further and based this subject on my initial idea for the structural concept, which was a circle. The underlying structure is what I'm going to show you now. There's a circle here. There's a circle here. And then another larger circle coming around like that and up like that. Then there's a part of a circle, which is this big curve here. And that's basically the underlying structure, consisting of these repeated circles that form a rhythmic structure. But, as I mentioned earlier in the video, you need some kind of opposing motif. Here the circle is one of the motifs, but then you need a subdominant opposing motif to add some contrast to the structure, provide some relief from all of the same shapes that you use for the dominant motif. So therefore, what I did was I added this horizontal line, straight line contrasting with the curves, and that divides the picture area, which, as you know, is all of this, into two rectangular shapes, although this shape looks a bit more like a square. All of this, and then there's the other rectangular shape down here. So I have these rectangular shapes as well as the circles that are part of this underlying structure or structural concept. When I started this rough sketch, it wasn't clear to me why I selected the circle. That became clear after I did more work on the rough sketch and as it developed into something more recognizable than just those scribbles that you saw earlier. So it's not always clear why a particular shape is selected to build the structure with. That may become more clear as you continue to work on your picture. The circle is a shape that encloses something, and it has this circular direction, wrapping around something. So these circles like that, wrapping around the wizard-like character here, suggests that the forest is protective of him. In the forest, there are these creatures that are waiting for him, and he senses that something is not quite right as he stands there contemplating whether he should enter the forest along this path. So that feeling of the forest protecting him is expressed, I hope, through those circles that act as a kind of frame around him, encircling him and protecting him, so to speak. These circle shapes are created by the implied lines that I showed you earlier. You don't see an actual line here, but you feel like there is a line. It's implied. And that's how these underlying structures are created, through these implied lines, which make implied shapes. So the circle is an implied shape created by implied lines. And those implied shapes are simple geometric shapes. Circle, triangle, square, and variations of these. So that means the circle could turn into an oval, like I showed you in some of my structures. The triangle, like that, could turn into this kind of triangle, or triangle on its side like that. The square turns into a rectangle. So these basic shapes can be changed in different ways, stretched and cut apart and distorted in different ways that can be used to construct the underlying structure with. So instead of a circle here, I could have had maybe an oval, or I could have had a triangle. As I've shown you, a picture has an underlying geometry, and that underlying geometry consists of simple geometric shapes like these, which are implied shapes. You don't actually see that circle over here. It's implied. So the structure consists of implied shapes. The underlying structure is necessary not only for the reasons that I already stated in this video, but also because the values that you add to your picture need something to hold on to. And it is this underlying structure that the values hold on to. They are the support for the values. When you build a house, there's a foundation, there's a framework structure onto which the walls are placed. Without that framework structure, you wouldn't have anything to put the walls on. So the same is true for a picture. This underlying structure acts as that framework, and the values are the walls, so to speak, that are applied to that structure and hold those values. It's something like this. Do a real quick sketch. Here's the foundation. Let's say this is a concrete slab for the house. Then you come along with your walls, and you want to put those walls on this concrete slab so that you can build your house. But there aren't any beams here. There are no studs. There's no framework to which you can put those walls onto. So what happens? The walls collapse. Nothing to hold them up. But if I put beams here, like that, now I can come in here with my wall and add those walls to the beams or studs. Those beams are holding up the walls. And the same goes for a picture. That underlying structure is those beams. And the walls, as I said, are the values that you add to that structure. These underlying structures can become quite complicated. Some of the old masters made very complicated structures. Structures that looked symmetrical, had all these different shapes, something like this, that they would then build the subject on. That's an underlying structure created with the triangle shape that you see here, and then the rectangle shape. See that right here, and it's repeated just as the triangle shape is repeated, thereby establishing a rhythmic underlying structure. Getting back to my circle structure here for a moment, remember that I said that the structure should lead to the center of interest. The center of interest in this picture is, of course, the wizard. And this underlying structure leads to the wizard. It draws your eye to the wizard because these circle shapes act as a frame around the wizard. They are encircling the wizard, thereby drawing the eye to the wizard. And of course, the eye is also led to the wizard because of strong value contrast. The dark value of the wizard against the lighter value of the sky. But the underlying structure also helps to draw attention to the wizard by acting as a kind of frame around the wizard. While I was working on this rough sketch and thinking about where I should place these circles, I kept in mind that this structure needed to draw attention to the center of interest, the wizard, and therefore they were placed the way they are now because they help to draw attention to the wizard. If I had placed circles over here or over here, that structure wouldn't have led to the wizard. Remember that when you are designing this underlying structure, it needs to be designed in such a way that it draws attention to the center of interest and not away from it. I darkened the sketch. It makes it look more menacing, more ominous, more mysterious. But that's about all I'm going to do on this rough sketch. When you design your underlying structure, and that's what you're doing, you're designing it, you need to think in terms of dividing the picture area, which, as you know, is this, or picture space, or pictorial space, different names for the same thing. So when you place that first line, think about how that first line divides that picture area. By placing that horizontal line there, I'm creating a large rectangle shape that you see here, and then a smaller rectangle shape here. So I have a dominance and a subdominance of size. So I'm dividing this picture space or pictorial space in an interesting way. I'm not dividing it like this, in which that horizontal line divides the picture area into two rectangle shapes that are the same in size. So when you begin to divide the picture area, think about where to place those initial lines and whether that placement of those initial lines creates an interesting division of space that is rhythmic. This division of space is rhythmic. There is variety here in these shapes. The shapes are varied in size and shape. You have large rectangle, you have a rectangle that's more elongated like that, then you have a rectangle that is close to a square, and then you have another rectangle that is of a different shape, and the sizes are all different. So I've divided the picture area in an interesting way, and not in a repetitive way like this, for example. If you divide your picture area like that, this is not interesting, and it results in a repetitive structure because each of these shapes is exactly the same in size and the same shape. it's not a varied structure. The repetition hasn't been varied, like in this example. So therefore, when you're dividing the picture area, think in rhythmic terms, in terms of whether this division of the picture area is resulting in a structure that has this kind of variation of sizes and shapes. To get the most interesting structure, which can result in the most interesting picture, this division of the picture area must have shapes that are all different in size and shape. That's how you get maximum interest. Another very important thing to keep in mind when you're dividing the picture area with these kind of lines is that you are dividing the picture area with the major lines, with the main lines. They're also referred to as the principal lines. And they must be kept few in number, otherwise things will get too complicated, and when that happens, confusion sets in. So you have to avoid dividing your picture area like this, where there's too many lines going all over the place like that, and you don't know which are the major lines. So in the initial stages, when you're planning your underlying structure, think only in terms of those few major lines, not something like this. Therefore, you keep the number few, probably no more than 4. So over here, for example, I could do something like this. So there are 2 lines, 3 lines, and 4 lines. 1, 2, 3, 4. Anything more than that, then things start getting a little too complicated. The idea is to plan and divide the picture area in terms of economy. That is, you use fewer of something, which results in a more economical initial structure. And things become much more easy when you think in more simple terms like this. Now that I've established a rhythmic structure here, I can go in there and add my objects or subject matter. In this case, I think I'm going to add this figure standing there like this. And maybe the figure is holding a staff of some sort. And figure's resting his hand on his hip. So something like that. And then back here, where the horizontal line is, that horizontal line could be a horizon, and then there's this town back here. And I'm just roughing this in, as you can see. Maybe some mountains way back there in the distance. So something like this. And it all started with just those 2 lines crossing each other, forming the cross structure. See how simple this composition looks? Because the structure that I started out with is simple, focusing on the major lines of division of the picture area, rather than starting out with something like that. Although you can start out like this, and these lines here can represent places where you put your shapes. They can help guide you in placing shapes. And this kind of structure is called dynamic symmetry. And I talk about it in one of my videos that you might have seen, where you do begin with a complex structure like this, and then you add your subject matter to the structure, placing shapes where those lines are located. So something like this, for example, maybe there's this guy here with this cart, but you don't follow those lines exactly. They're just a rough guide to give you some ideas as to where you can place shapes. But using this method, while it can result in some interesting looking compositions, You're not working with the major lines of division like you are in this example. In this kind of approach, you don't use every line in that structure of all these lines. They're just there as a rough guide for the placement of your shapes, as I said. But I'm not focusing on this. I'm focusing on the more simple division of the picture area using the major lines. Another thing I want to point out to you, this division of the picture area results in a symmetrical design because the top, bottom, left, and right sides are exactly the same. However, in this arrangement, the result is an asymmetric composition where the left, right, top, and bottom sides are not exactly the same. They're all different, resulting in a more interesting composition than this would if I added the figure here, and the figure would be centered like this, and then the town in the back would be centered as well. I think you can see that when you divide the picture area like this, which results in a symmetrical division of the picture area, isn't as interesting looking as one in which you divide the picture area in an asymmetrical way like this, where there is much more variety than in this example. Remember, variety is the key to creating interest. So far in this video, I've been focusing on underlying structures that are constructed with straight lines or the circle. However, it's not just the straight lines that are used in an underlying structure like you see here, for example, or in these other examples. You can also create structures in which there are rhythmic lines that predominate. That is, there may be straight lines also, but there are going to be more of these rhythmic lines. And these rhythmic lines are sometimes called S-lines or reverse curves. So I'm going to roughly sketch in some kind of structure here, something like this. You see these rhythmic lines. And again, I'm only using a limited number. I'm not using a lot of them. Only the primary or main lines that divide the picture area into this web-like structure. So a grid-like structure would consist more of straight lines like you see here. A web-like structure would consist more of these rhythmic lines. And again, just like in this example here, you can see that I divided the picture area in such a way as to create variety, and which results in an asymmetrical arrangement rather than in a symmetrical arrangement like this. In addition, you might notice that there are these intersecting lines here and here. They're near each other. This whole area here consists of these intersecting lines. And the reason for that is because, just like in this example here, the eye is drawn to where the lines cross each other, and therefore, if I place my center of interest within that area where those lines are intersecting with each other, that will draw the eye of the viewer to this area here where the center of interest is located. When you divide up your picture area using these kind of rhythmic lines, the result is a structure that looks like it has more movement, appears more graceful looking, appears more lifelike than if you have a structure like this, for example, down here with straight lines. Compare these two examples. Which one do you think appears to have more movement, appears more graceful looking, and appears to have more of this feeling of a lifelike quality to it? You'll probably say this one does. That, however said, that doesn't mean that you never use straight lines. In fact, probably most of the underlying structures are constructed with straight lines. But if you want more of this rhythmic quality, more of a graceful appearance or more of an organic feel to the structure, then you use rhythmic lines like this. In landscape painting, you'll find a lot of these kind of structures in which rhythmic lines like this make up that underlying structure. So if you're going to be designing a composition for a landscape, you might want to use this kind of web structure with these rhythmic lines instead of straight lines. But you will need to add some straight lines to create some kind of contrast. Straight lines, when added to a structure, provide strength to that structure, while these rhythmic curved lines provide a feeling of movement and life. Here's another example of the use of these rhythmic lines, and again I'm using 1, 2, 3, although you could use 4. Like I said, I wouldn't go more than 4, or you could just use 2 like that, and then build your picture on that structure. So here I have, let's say, these rocks over here, side of a mountain, and then over here I have some figures like that, maybe some figures over here as well. So I'm building something and I'm keeping that underlying structure in mind, but I don't have to follow it exactly. You don't do that. That's just a rough guide that tells you what the structure is going to be, but that doesn't mean you're going to end up with a structure that looks exactly the way you started out with. That rhythmic line may change. It may be placed up there, or maybe further down here, and that rhythmic line may be placed over here eventually, or maybe over there. You're just starting out with some kind of rough guide as to what the structure is going to be, which helps you in the distribution and placement of the various objects or shapes that you place into the picture. And just because I have this line here doesn't mean that that necessarily has to be a hill. That could be maybe part of a foreground figure here. Something like that. And then there might be some figures back here, creating that implicit line that I talked about, like this, you see? Continuing over here at the base of this mountain, like that. So now I have that rhythmic line here. And I make a few adjustments over here, like that. And then I have that other rhythmic line right there, resulting in that structure, using two main lines, or principal lines, as they are also referred to. One of the important things that I mentioned earlier is that don't make your structures look obvious. Don't make your implied lines look obvious. So for example, this line here looks a little hidden, but it could be hidden even more by bringing down those rocks like this. And then that implied line is still there, but it's more hidden now than it was before. And you can see it here. It stops here, but then over here it continues up like that. There's that little gap that I talked about earlier, the implied line there. The whole line isn't an actual line, as you know, but you get the feeling that there's a line there. So therefore it's referred to as an implied line, which is a line, in this case, that is more hidden, but it's still there. You get the feeling that there is still this rhythmic line there. Having started the structure with the major lines dividing the picture area like that into a rhythmic structure, all the shapes are different in size and shape, thereby creating the most interesting division of the picture area that is possible, and then adding a subject to that division of space. Now I can go in here and I can add other objects, other lines, other shapes to complete the composition. Let's say I want to add something within this area. Looks a little empty, so I might add a spaceship coming in. Now when you do add other elements, you have to think about where should they be placed, and if they establish an implied line, which in turn may create an implied shape. So you don't just add additional elements anywhere. For example, if I placed the spaceship over here like this, I placed it without thinking where it should be placed. And that is a no-no. You don't do that, or you'll ruin your composition. So you have to think about, well, if I place it here, maybe it will line up with this guy over here and create an implied line like that, dividing the picture area the way you see. Or maybe it should be positioned like this, coming in from the left, moving toward the right. So you have to be careful where you place those additional elements. You also have to consider the shape of the object that you're going to be adding to your composition. So instead of having a spaceship that looks long like that, a long spaceship, well, maybe it needs to be of a different shape. Maybe something like this. And then how does that shape relate to all the other shapes? So maybe the spaceship is coming in like that. I can see that the spaceship looks a little too centered within the picture area. It might be better if I move it over toward the right. See what that looks like. Well, maybe. I'm looking to see if the spaceship is creating implied lines, creating that continuity that I talked about earlier, where the eye moves from one shape to another. Or maybe the spaceship works better over here. While having the spaceship in this position adds more weight to the left side, balancing this big mass over here better. The problem, however, is that the eye is led like this, and the spaceship's pointing up away from everything else. So, what could be done is to move the spaceship back to where it's closer to the mountain. Now there's a better movement, so the eye moves like this over to the spaceship, up, but then I need to bring the eye back, and that can be done by having other spaceships that are coming in, maybe of a different shape, like this. So there might be a whole fleet coming in, and thereby the eye is led back down to where it started. So there's this circular movement like that. Whenever you place shapes within your composition, you need to be aware of the fact that they may be creating implied lines or implied shapes. So for example, by placing these spaceships over here, I can see that an implied shape has been created because of the implied lines that are there. Can you see the implied shape? Well, it's right here. That's the implied line coming down and then coming over like that, and then up the spaceships, and then up the spaceship like that, creating this triangle implied line. You see it? You get the feeling that there is this triangle shape. As you add more shapes or elements to your composition, it becomes more complex. But it's always best to start out in a very simple way, like I did, with just these two main lines. Then, by adding a spaceship and these spaceships over here, the composition becomes more complex because now I also have this implied triangle shape that wasn't part of this initial structure. But that's okay. You may start out simple, but then the structure may become more complex as the composition develops. On the other hand, you try to keep it as simple as possible. But if that's not possible, then you have to add a bit more complexity to the structure, just as I had to do in this case here. As I'm looking at this composition, I can see that that triangle shape actually extends further down, like this, to the back of his arm right there. You get the feeling that there's a line, that implied line that I'm talking about. So that line extends all the way down like that, and then this spear that this figure is holding actually moves up and into the spaceship like that, thereby making that triangle that I had there before even larger in size. But that other triangle is still there, right there, you see? So I can divide this bigger triangle with this line here. So I'm actually adding to this structure, and therefore that structure begins to change somewhat. I'll add that implied line over here, and then this slightly curved line over here, making that triangle shape. So now the structure looks more like this. And I'm showing you here how the structure that you start out with, which can be very simple, may change as you develop your composition. Nothing is set in stone, but try to begin in a simple way, and then, if necessary, you modify that structure, you add to it or take away from it until you arrive at the kind of composition that is going to be the most effective composition for what you want to say. Now, in addition, if you think back to some of the videos that you've seen, I talk about the importance of linking shapes together, linking your darks, linking your lights, linking your midtones. So, for example, this dark shape here doesn't link up with the dark shapes over here, and therefore they appear separated and not unified. To unify them, I need to connect them, link them. And therefore, what I can do to link them is to make this part of the picture dark, like that, thereby linking up with this figure here and creating this overall dark shape, like that. And remember what you learned about shapes, how to make them interesting. They need to be interesting. The dark shapes, the light shapes, the mid-tone shapes, they all need to be interesting. And the implied line is still there. Right there, you see? You don't lose it completely. Make sure that it still is there. Now you can see that the composition holds together much better where these dark shapes are. All of that holds together because they're linked. Connecting these darks the way I did now creates this large dark mass that helps to create a great feeling of depth within this picture. The dark values are up front while the lighter ones are further back, which helps to create this feeling of depth. One more thing I'm going to do before I move on, and that is I'm going to create this gradation of value in the sky like that. Now you might remember, I mentioned this in one of my other videos, the eye follows a gradation, moving from dark to light. Therefore, the eye moves into the picture from the top down by way of that gradation of value from dark to light. So apply this device to your own pictures to lead the eye into the picture. Here's another thing that I do want to show you, and that is there's another curvilinear or rhythmic line, and that starts back here where the hills are, right there, you see? And it extends into the mountain, like that. So there's this rhythmic or undulating line there. Again, making that initial structure down here a little more complex. So I'm going to add that line, and it's something like this. So you see this web structure that I've built, and that rhythmic line up here continues over here because I added this darker line right there on the mountain so that I can get this longer implied line going on. If that line were not there, then that rhythmic line would stop there, and I wouldn't be able to extend it. But this way I create this continuity, the eye is flowing along those hills and into the mountain. And these kind of implied lines also create connections. So I'm connecting the mountain with these hills back here. A connection is being formed. So this is very important, and these kind of connections help to hold the whole composition together and move the eye through the composition, because the eye is following these implied lines.